All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. All right, guys, introducing William Van Wagenen. He is a research fellow at the Libertarian Institute and is a great investigative journalist. And we are so proud to announce that we have finally published his great book, Creative Chaos, Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government. And it is our 17th book, I believe, at the Libertarian Institute. And you can find that at libertarianinstitute.org/books. And, of course, at Amazon.com, where right now, of course, it's #1 in Syrian history, and I think it's #2 or 3 in terrorism, but it's doing great. And this is such an important work, and the long-form, massive investigations that William did for the Institute, previous to this, that were, basically the basis of the research for this book. I was so heavily dependent on all of that work for my explanations of the war in Syria and Iraq War III in Enough Already, All Errors Mine, and a lot of other sources too. I read a bunch of books and this and that, but man, did I reread everything that William wrote for sure before I was done with that to make sure that I knew I was right. And so this book is so fantastic, and I demand that you all not just get it, but also read it, Creative Chaos. Welcome to the show. How you doing, William?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Very happy to have you here. So the bad news and the good news is that I haven't read this book in like a year. So you'll just have to remind me what it's all about. You want to start with how you got interested in this topic in the first place?
Yeah, so I've been, following events in the Middle East for, I guess, about the same amount of time as you. I think we're about the same age. And first went to Palestine in 2003, and then spent time in Iraq during the war in 2005 and 2006. And but I didn't know that much about Syria, even though I followed everything else pretty closely. So at the beginning of the war in 2011, I kind of, believed the mainstream narrative. There was a dictator suppressing peaceful protests for democracy, things like that. I kind of believed the general narrative about the Arab Spring in general. But as I started, to just learn more and research more about Syria and then what happened in the early days of the war and how it all started, and then also started researching more about the different armed groups that were fighting against the Assad government that were portrayed as being moderate rebels, again, fighting for freedom and democracy. The more I researched that, I realized, well, actually, these are extremist Salafist militias. Many of them are chock full of al-Qaeda fighters from Iraq and from Lebanon. And there was also a lot of reporting in the Western press at the time that, these, once it kind of became clear that al-Qaeda in the form of the Nusra Front and ISIS that those groups were active in Syria in the fighting, there was a lot of propaganda or reports in the Western media saying that Assad had created these groups as a way to discredit the Syrian opposition and try to gain sympathy with the West and try to appeal to the West, the U.S. and Europe as a partner in the so-called war on terror. And again, as I looked more and more closely at it, I realized it was very clear that no, actually it was the U.S., Israel, Britain and France, primarily Turkey as well, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, that this coalition of intelligence agencies from those countries, that they were the ones who were, clearly supporting ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. And anyway, so once I saw that contradiction, kind of saw through that propaganda, I guess you'd say, I just kind of got obsessed with the topic and started writing, as you mentioned, these really massive articles for you at the Institute. And, so that's kind of the origins of where the book came from, all that research that I did, as you mentioned.
Great. Okay, man. Well, look, I'm just as lucky as I could be, and I'm so grateful to have you as, an associate by way of the Institute and to have proximity to your great work here. Can we start with the neocon plan to destroy Syria?
Yeah. So again, the mainstream narrative is that the Arab Spring protests, not only in Syria, but also in Tunisia, Egypt, etc., were these grassroots protests to overthrow these Arab dictators. But if you look at it more closely, you can see that these Jewish neoconservatives that had a lot of influence in the Bush administration, they are the ones who actually began the planning to topple the Syrian government. And it was that planning and those policies that were then picked up or continued by the Obama administration to try to topple the Syrian government in 2011, and the Tunisian government, and the Egyptian government, and the Libyan government, and the Yemeni government. All of those Arab Spring protests were actually sparked by the Obama administration, the State Department, the CIA, working closely with tech companies like Facebook, Twitter. But again, the origins of it goes back to the Bush administration. I'm sure your listeners are, of course, aware of, I guess, two important things. One is the Yannan plan, which is an old Israeli plan to try to divide both Iraq and Syria and divide them up into weak ethnic or religious-based statelets that would have no ability to challenge Israel. That's an Israeli policy that goes back to the 80s. And then also, I'm sure your listeners remember the revelation that came from Wesley Clark, the former NATO head, who said that members of the Bush administration told him after 9/11 that there was a plan to take out 7 countries in 5 years. And that, of course, is what led to the Iraq invasion in 2003. But then it's also what led to the Syria war in 2011. So people like Richard Pearl, especially, were making plans to topple the Syrian government back in 2005, 2006, 2007. And again, it's basically on behalf of Israel. And as you know, a couple, maybe it's already been 2 years now, but your institute published this great book about the Iraq War called Israel, the Real Winner of the Iraq War, I think it is. And, that was an excellent book showing that the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, it was really for the sake of Israel. It was to extract oil from Iraq that could be sent to Israel. And at any rate, it was basically neoconservatives in the Bush administration and later the Obama administration that were guiding this policy to also topple Bashar al-Assad, just as Saddam was toppled, but in a more indirect way, again, using these AstroTurf protests and then combining that with an al-Qaeda-led insurgency. So when the protests finally broke out in Syria in 2011, the protests themselves were organized by a lot of activists, Syrian activists who had been on the U.S., the State Department payroll. They had been, flown out to conferences in New York and Beirut to learn how to use these new tech tools like Twitter and Facebook to organize protests. And then on top of that, the U.S. released all these top members of the Islamic State in Iraq from the prison in Camp Abuka in Basra. They released a lot of these guys in 2009, 2010. And then in late 2010, they sent them all to to Syria, from Iraq to Syria, to then start attacking Syrian police and security forces, but like under the cover of these protests. So in the Western press, we got the impression that, again, there are peaceful protests and that Bashar al-Assad was cracking down on them by having his security forces mercilessly open fire on peaceful protesters. But in reality, these al-Qaeda-linked fighters would infiltrate the protests, shoot members of the Syrian police and security forces, and also do false flag killings of protesters as well. Blame those on the government in an effort to basically, create hatred for the Syrian government that didn't exist before, and get the snowball rolling of a quote unquote revolution.
Mm-hmm. Now, William, let me ask you
that's
here.
That's kind of how it all began.
Yeah, let me go ahead. Oh, sorry, I could have just let you finish that sentence probably. Let me just ask you here. As you know, William, the show, obviously we deal with very specialized subject matter and deep dives, as your book is, and getting all into this, which I want to do. But at the same time, the show is also for beginners and people who are kind of new to this and probably just heard of me yesterday and you today, okay, right? So they would be very rational to think that this is probably not right. What do you mean America would be on the side of Osama bin Laden and the suicide bombers? I mean, if you're just full truther, and of course the suicide bombers always work for America with no exceptions, then I guess you just take that for granted or something. But I think for a normal person, which I don't believe that, by the way, but if you're just a normal person, you might wonder if it's really right. Like, make me understand why. What could possibly be a good enough reason or a compelling enough reason for the American war party to switch sides in the war on terrorism to the terrorists? Circa 2011? Isn't that the exact same time that Barack Obama is literally killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistan? What do you mean he's taking the jihadi side in Syria?
No, that's a great question. And I guess the basic answer is, a lot of these radical Islamic groups have connections with U.S. intelligence that go back decades, and even further than that, have connections to British intelligence, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. And I guess the basic idea is if there's a government or a state that you want to weaken or create chaos there, overthrow it, you got to find some people crazy enough to, if you can give them some weapons and some funding, you got to find some people that are crazy enough to go after that government and fight on your behalf as a proxy. And again, there's just a long precedent, going back to the 80s with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The UK was like the center of London, especially, but even it happened in New York. There were Islamic groups that had connections to MI6 and the CIA that were recruiting fighters to go from all across the world to go to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets, the Soviet army, which had occupied Afghanistan. Obviously, the Saudi intelligence and Pakistani intelligence were crucial partners in that effort, but a lot of this activity, began especially in London, and so then from there, the same thing happened in Bosnia in the 90s. The U.S. and the UK were intelligence were recruiting Islamic extremists, a lot of them born in the UK, like South Asian background, Pakistani or Libyan background, also to go fight in Afghanistan and then in Bosnia, and then even in Kosovo. It's well documented that the CIA was supporting the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was fighting to help NATO break off Kosovo from Serbia. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was bin Laden's right-hand man, he was running training camps in Albania that were supporting the KLA and fighting on NATO's behalf. So there is this long precedent. And then after that, you get to 9/11. And, whatever your view on 9/11 is, of course, as you mentioned, there are people who would say that that was an inside job. And basically the Israelis orchestrated 9/11 in order to, basically forced the United States to take Israel's side in launching this so-called war on terror, so that again they could topple these 7 governments in 5 years. Or on the other hand, if you think, well, no, Osama bin Laden did do 9/11. This was blowback. Whatever your view on 9/11 is, there is the indisputable precedent that in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, and in Kosovo, the U.S. and the U.K. were supporting al-Qaeda groups, and so it shouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to understand that if the U.S. and U.K., again for Israel's benefit, wanted to topple the Syrian government, that using these al-Qaeda militants in these prisons in Iraq would be the best way to do it. I mean, it's pretty hard to launch a full invasion. The Israeli lobbyists in Washington and the people in the Pentagon that were Zionists that launched the Iraq war. That's a pretty big project to pull off, to get the entire U.S. military to invade a country. And it's a little bit easier just to throw some money and weapons at some Islamic extremists, and you just use them as a proxy to create chaos in Syria or wherever else. And I'm of the view as well, maybe this is different from you, that al-Qaeda in Iraq, I mean, going back to the Zarqawi days, that al-Qaeda in Iraq was a creation of U.S. and Israeli intelligence, basically by way of the Kurds, by way of Masoud Barzani. The Kurds were basically running al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003, 2004, 2005, because the Israelis wanted a sectarian civil war there, just like they later got in Syria. People in the U.S. military, I think a lot of the U.S. military members, whether generals or even low-level soldiers, I think they went into Iraq thinking that they were going to bring democracy, they were going to do some nation building, they were going to improve life for Iraqis. But the pro-Israel neocons in Washington, who really orchestrated that invasion, they had different ideas. The invasion was just the first step. The second step was to destroy the Iraqi state, divide it up into a Kurdish area, a Sunni in the north, a Sunni area in the west, and a Shia area in the south. So a strong Arab leader like Saddam Hussein could never threaten Israel again, and again to extract oil, especially from Kirkuk, to be sent via Turkey to Israel. That was a major goal of the war. And the best way to do that was to have a guy like Zarqawi, doing suicide bombings against the Shia in Karbala and Najaf, and in Khadamiyah, the Shia area of Baghdad. And then also to support groups like the Badr Brigade, these guys in the Dawa party that had been in Iran for decades. Hire these guys, put them in the Ministry of Interior, send these death squads around Baghdad and murder Sunnis, detain people because they have a Sunni name, take them to the basement of the Ministry of Interior, and use these power drills, put a power drill through someone's leg or through their shoulder or eventually through their head, and just create a sectarian civil war. So I don't know if there's time to go into it, but the whole history of al-Qaeda in Iraq has the footprints of the Kurds all over it. You'll notice that suicide bombings basically never happened in the Kurdish areas. And the relationship between al-Qaeda in Iraq and then later ISIS and the Kurds is just rock solid, and not that many people know that. And that has implications for the Yazidi genocide in 2014 as well, where basically that genocide, even though ISIS carried it out, did the killing, the raping, the murdering, the enslaving of Yazidi women, but that was all facilitated by Masoud Barzani and the Kurdish Peshmerga, who are close allies of the United States and especially Israel. Israeli intelligence has a very strong presence in the Kurdish region of Iraq. So anyway, that's a very, very long answer. But the point is, regardless of your view on 9/11, there's all these other instances or precedents of U.S. and allied intelligence agencies supporting al-Qaeda. to achieve their goals. Again, not going all the way back at least to Afghanistan in the 80s. And so, I was just, that's one thing that motivated me to really write so much about Syria and eventually to do the book, is that I thought, like you, that that's very scandalous. I can't believe that the United States is supporting actual Al Qaeda groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. And it's even, I mean, it should be even more shocking that, that the current president of Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who now goes by the name of Ahmed al-Shara, that he's now the Syrian president. There's literally a former ISIS commander as the president of Syria. And he was immediately recognized by the Americans and the British and basically everybody else. And now he's, actively working to divide Syria according to Israeli goals. If you want, we could talk about that a little bit. But at any rate, I just found that very scandalous that the U.S. was supporting Al Qaeda, and they were constantly in the Western press saying that actually it was Assad who was supporting Al Qaeda and ISIS and Nusra. And that was just so disgusting to me that that's what motivated me in a large way to write the book.
Yeah, well, that last one was a huge bit of completely upside down, ridiculous propaganda at that time. That ISIS was, Assad is creating them just to discredit the rest of his enemies and this kind of thing. Pretty ridiculous. Now, but I want to talk about Iraq War II some more. So, I mean, there was a lot of fighting over Kirkuk, and I think ultimately, at least at that time, the Kurds had the advantage and cleansed a hell of a lot of Sunnis out of Kirkuk during that era of like 2006 through maybe 5 and 6. So I guess that would coincide with your theory then, if essentially the meanest of the Sunni insurgency are bought off by, is it Talibani or Barzani who's their biggest benefactor, or both? That's, you're saying, really the secret power behind the bin Ladenite Sunnis, the bin Ladenite led Sunni insurgency in Western Iraq?
Yeah. And so, for example, as I mentioned, all these mujahideen went to Afghanistan to fight for the CIA against the Soviets in the 80s.
Sure. Well, by the way, I mean, first of all, we all know that. And it's in the book that, Bill Clinton backed him in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya and all that. But now we're talking about post 9/11 and post, now into Iraq War II, which, by the way, the Washington Post version has it, that the CIA and the NSC were complaining to them that they knew the Saudis were backing the Sunni insurgency against us all this time. Although, I don't know, I guess that could have been one department of the CIA complaining about another one or something, if they're really working. And of course, it's the Sunni insurgency that killed the vast majority of the Americans who died in this thing. So if America and Israel are working with the Kurds to back the Zarqawiites to kill American soldiers and Marines, I'm not sure I really, I don't know, but I guess I'll just ask you, please elaborate about exactly how you know that. I mean, I know that you spent time in Kurdistan. I know that you know and interviewed all these Yazidis at length and all of that. But so you just talk a little bit more about the mechanics of all that and how exactly it works. If you can, elaborate about the 2004, 2005 era is the real dawn of the worst of the Sunni-based insurgency there, right?
Yeah. So, and this is something I only realized or learned, pretty recently. And again, I was in Iraq way back in 2005, 2006, and I've been studying that war for a long time. And only 20 years later did I think I kind of have a more accurate view of what happened, which is that, again, going back to the Mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan against the Soviets, it's not very well known, but there was a pretty big Kurdish contingent. So once these Kurdish Mujahideen came back, after 1991, there was the U.S. no-fly zone over the Kurdish region of Iraq. And these Mujahideen former Mujahideen were all there, these Islamic extremists who had a Salafist ideology. And what were they doing? In the 90s, a civil war broke out between Kurds, between Masoud Barzani's KDP party, based out of Erbil, and Jalal Talabani's PUK, party based in the other half of Kurdistan near in Sulaymaniyah. And Masoud Barzani basically gave weapons and funded these mujahideen that had returned from Afghanistan, and they fought with him alongside the KDP Peshmerga against Jalal Talabani's PUK Peshmerga. And these mujahideen, they established their own Islamic emirate in Halabja, or near Halabja, which again, your listeners might know because that was the town that was gassed, presumably by Saddam in the 80s. But Halabja is famous for that. But in the 90s, near Halabja, there was these Islamic emirates that were being that were full of these Kurdish mujahideen training camps that were, again, supported by Masoud Barzani. He was using these guys to fight against his Kurdish rival, Jalal Talabani. So then, after 9/11, as we know, Paul Wolfowitz, like the day after 9/11, he went to whatever meeting, maybe it was National Security Council meeting with Bush and the guys, and said, "Hey guys, so when are we going to invade Iraq?" And people were a bit confused by that. They're like, "Well, I thought Al Qaeda was in Afghanistan."
It was even that day. And of course, Rumsfeld and the Pentagon too. Contact Wolfowitz for connections between Saddam Hussein and OBL. Sweep it all up, things related and not, in the handwriting of Stephen Cambone, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence.
Yeah, and Cambone, he played a big role in the Abu Ghraib stuff, which maybe we could get to. So anyways, they needed, of course, a way to connect Osama bin Laden to Saddam Hussein to justify the invasion. Of course, they had the weapons of mass destruction excuse, but they also kind of had this dual track effort to also say, well, Al Qaeda and Saddam are working together and 9/11, so we got to invade Iraq. So the easiest way to do that was to basically plant Zarqawi in Iraq, or point to the fact that he was in Iraq and say, maybe you don't agree he was planted there, but at least look, there's this guy Zarqawi, he's in Iraq. And that proves that Saddam and Al Qaeda are working together. And so this is what Colin Powell focused on in his UN speech a few months ahead of the Iraq invasion.
Well, I can definitely point out, part of this, I don't know who put him there. I mean, I know that he left Afghanistan and went to where he was not directly tied to bin Laden. He had met him before or whatever, but was not his agent, not sworn loyalty to him. And then had somehow traveled to Kurdistan. And then from there, and I knew this better before, and I should have saved maybe I do have an article, William, somewhere where I saved all these links back then. I could try to recreate the old stuff, but there are a bunch of stories, man. I think even books are written about this. But the most famous thing is Jim Miklaszewski at NBC News had this. But there's CIA and Special Forces guys have written about this, people who lived through it, and just, I don't know, man. There's got to be at least 6 or 7 or 8 or more sources about this, which is about how the Special Forces guys on the ground, CIA, Black Ops guys on the ground before the war, they wanted to kill Zarqawi. And the Pentagon wanted to kill Zarqawi in Kurdistan, where he's safe and protected from Saddam. As you say, they're pretending Saddam is backing this guy. They even pretended Saddam operated on him, gave him a peg leg, and saved his life. So not only is he supposedly connected to Osama, but here he's directly connected to the dictator who must have authorized the peg leg operation, right? And so this is a lie that they got from Ahmed Chalabi. But the Pentagon is saying, let us kill him. And Bush turned them down over and over and over again. And I'm not exactly sure the mechanism of it. They kept bringing it up. But it was one of those things where it was really obvious. Like, I told you to stop asking me about that. And this guy really, obviously they built this giant legend about him at the time that he was just responsible for the whole insurgency. And that's why you were supposed to discredit the whole insurgency as not nationalist insurgency at all, but all of it is bin Ladenite inspired craziness, right? As evidenced by the existence of this guy's Zarqawi. So they needed him as the excuse to start the war, and they used him terribly as the scapegoat for the whole insurgency once the war began. But they absolutely could have killed him, and not just woulda, coulda, shoulda, but the lower authorities begged Bush for permission to kill him and were denied time and time again for months leading up to the war, which is one of the worst scandals of the war, quite frankly. And if you're telling me that, yeah, America was in on it with Barzani to back AQ against our guys, then that is on the level of the highest treason in all history right there, where Republicans still to this day deserve to be strung up for that. And CIA officers too, sounds like.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, they're half 50% of the reason to go to war in Iraq was because this guy Zarqawi, who wasn't even in a part of Iraq that was under Saddam's control. It was in a part of Iraq under U.S. control and Israeli control in Kurdistan, in a training camp full of Kurdish mujahideen on Masoud Barzani's payroll.
Oh, and they tortured the Libyan.
And as you mentioned,
Ibn al-Libi into saying that it was Saddam who taught him and Zarqawi how to make chemical weapons. And that was why supposedly he was making ricin and other chemical weapons there.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that the same torture myth that they got, or the same chemical weapons myth that they got out of al-Libi was the connection to Zarqawi too? Do I remember that correctly?
I believe so. I'd have to double check, but
I'm sorry to interrupt you, dude. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But definitely they tortured a Libby to create that link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, but
and chemical weapons as well. Yeah.
So they've got Zarqawi there, and as you mentioned, they had of course they could have killed him. And in fact, the Pentagon, there was a general, there's a big article about this in the Wall Street Journal. I forget, I apologize, I forget the name of the article, but it was published sometime in 2002. And this American general wanted to bomb this training camp where Zarqawi was supposedly there. And they sent the request to Bush and Bush's cabinet, and they literally couldn't get an answer. They just got ignored. They got zero answer. And the general later said that this was one of the best targets they ever had in terms of like the intelligence was good. There was going to be zero collateral damage, zero civilians killed in the strike. And they couldn't get permission. They couldn't even get Bush, whoever's pulling the strings behind Bush, whatever. They couldn't even get an answer. Finally, once Powell then goes to the UN, blames all this stuff on Zarqawi and says, we got to invade Iraq. Finally, when they invade Iraq in March of 2003, they finally bomb Zarqawi's training camp. But guess who wasn't there?
Right.
Of course, Zarqawi, by
listen, I blame the CIA right now, William, because every time I try to Google that Wall Street Journal article, my Mozilla crashes.
Yeah, maybe we got to use Yandex or something. So as soon as they no longer, needed him as a pretext and the invasion was already, launched. Finally, they're like, okay, now we'll bomb the training camp. But, again, either they tipped him off or he was escaped. So they were okay to bomb the place. But then, it gets worse. Again, like I said, if you go back to the Annan plan in the 80s, this was Israel's policy, is to divide these countries. So it wasn't enough to just topple Saddam and then try to let Iraq flourish and become like a functioning country and a functioning state, lift the sanctions. Again, I'm sure most American generals and soldiers thought was the agenda. But these neocons in the Bush administration, they had other ideas. What they wanted to do was create additional chaos and basically implement stage 2 of the operation, which was to divide the country, which requires a sectarian civil war.
Let me ask you something, because my idea of that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to quibble with you all through your thing here. I'll let you have your say. But my idea there was that, no, it was supposed to be easy. If you read the clean break, it was supposed to be easy to tame these Iraqi Shia. But the problem was Ayatollah Sistani came out and said, hey, if you believe in God, I want you to go outside and demand one man, one vote, and challenge W. Bush, basically. You ready to start this war all over again, boy? And then this is in January of 2004. And Bush said no. And Ayatollah Sistani said in no uncertain terms, then me and my guys are going to write the new constitution and rule the new government. And you're going to bow down to us, not the other way around. And how do you like that? And Bush could either cut and run then or go ahead and complete the job for Iran's men And it seemed like it was, and this is why I was not surprised. It is astonishing, but it should not have been surprising, the level of treason, what they did in Syria, because we already knew from March, I always say March, but I think maybe it's May of 2007, when Seymour Hersh wrote The Redirection, that we knew. And hell, I had an article in Newsweek about we want to switch back to the Sunnis from the spring of 2006, where it was Khalilzad and Abrams said we really screwed up here. And to reverse this, we need to do the redirection where we tilt back toward the bin Ladenites. And so that policy was from 06. That was kind of at the core of the awakening strategy in Iraq, where it was not so much aligned with the bin Ladenites as trying to marginalize them, but it was aligned with the bin Ladenites in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran, where they were back in Jandala, cutting people's heads off and doing suicide attacks and all that. All of that, the redirection was 2 years before Obama ever came to town, right? So when he continued Bush's policy in Syria, after all, it was Elizabeth Cheney who created the government in exile, including the Muslim Brotherhood, that they were trying to put in power to replace Assad. I actually was just Googling that footnote for my interview with Lex Friedman, where I try to sound as much like you as I can.
Well, yeah, again, I guess, these days I feel like I disagree with Seymour Hersh more and more. And I feel like maybe there was less of a redirection and more of, again, like in Iraq, just literally supporting both sides. I mean, it's the old Iran-Iraq war strategy where you fund both sides so that they kill each other. And if one side's going to win, then you kind of back off supporting them and you support the other side. And when that side's going to win, then you back off and support the other side. And as long as, both sides are killing each other, then you are happy.
Well, those of you who listen to me tell you to listen to Mike Swanson at Wall Street Window and Tim Fry at Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. Have bought a bunch of gold, must be doing great right now, and should probably donate to the Libertarian Institute. Robertson Roberts is the best. It's a matter of trust. There's no flashy gimmicks, risky schemes, or bait and switch scams here. Robertson Roberts is here to help you protect your wealth. Any portfolio ought to have a solid percentage in metals. For us Austrian school types, even more. Go to Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. at rrbi.co to protect yourself from monetary inflation. That's rrbi.co. Hey y'all, LibertasBella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs too. That's libertasbella.com. Hey y'all, I've been working on the audiobook of my new book, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. I've now finished and posted part 3 of the audiobook to my Substack and Patreon at scotthortonshow.com and patreon.com/scotthortonshow. So that finishes all of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. I know there's still a long way to go, but just these first 2 chapters are almost 10 hours of audio to get you started. I promise I'm doing the rest as fast as I can. Get the audiobook of Provoked first. Subscribe at scotthortonshow.com or patreon.com/scotthortonshow. I mean, but isn't it right, though, that the Shiites weren't supposed to have a will of their own? Ayatollah Sistani was not supposed to pull out a giant rubber stamp and veto W. Bush's plan. They wanted to create a government, a caucus system, where they handpicked leaders of different factions to essentially do what they were told. And then they found out that actually the supermajority doesn't need us that bad. They'll take our help, but they're, at the end of the day, who's zooming who, right? I don't know. I just don't think Paul Wolfowitz is that smart. I read The Clean Break, and I think the thing that David Wormser is most convinced about is that he's smart. Otherwise, he wouldn't be listening to Chalabi. He's telling himself, this guy Chalabi, I trust him, and this is going to be great. You know what I mean? I don't know. If you read, especially they wrote a whole book about The Clean Break called Tyranny's Ally. It was like, Chalabi assures us this is going to be dope, dude.
Yeah, I mean, and there's probably a lot of different agendas and a lot of different tactics and things. So it's kind of hard to say, but at least, the pattern that I notice is that, again, going back to, again, the Yan'an Plan, or even David Wormser's writings, where he's constantly saying we got to break these states up into small ethnic or familial tribal statelets. One way or another, you want to try and get there. And again, like civil war or sectarian war is kind of the easiest way. And so when, for example, after Zarqawi escaped the bombing in 2003, after the U.S. invaded, his original group of people were Kurds. The original fighters around Zarqawi were Kurds. From there, they started, recruiting Sunni Arabs. But the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they continued to be controlled by the Kurds. And by that, I mean literally like Kurdish politicians. So, for example, in Mosul, in 2007, there were all kinds of murders and killings of Christians and Yazidis in Mosul. And all of the Yazidis I talked to, they say that these Al-Qaeda groups that were murdering people in Mosul, that was one of the most dangerous places in the country, that these Al-Qaeda groups were literally being run by a Kurdish politician that's high up in the KDP. His name is Khosrow Gorani. And that's what all these Yazidis say, is that the Kurds were running the Al-Qaeda groups that were killing them and the Christians. Like, for example, these Yazidis and Christians would get kidnapped in Mosul, and Kurds would come and take over their homes. When they would pay ransoms to get these people out, they'd always have to deliver the ransom to a part of Mosul that was under tight control of the Kurdish Peshmerga. This is where all the activity was. And again, with the Yazidis, there's a much bigger history there, which I guess, again, if there's time, I could talk about. But again, if you notice, when Zarqawi started doing all these big suicide bombings, he first hit the UN building. Then again, he was hitting Najaf, he was hitting Karbala, he was hitting Baghdad. All these suicide bombings were sparking eventually sparked a civil war between the Sunni and Shia. But almost never was there a suicide bombing in Kurdistan. And Zarqawi supposedly would say, oh, well, we're fighting these Shia because they're collaborating with the Americans, which they were. The Shia, as you mentioned, Sistani, they said, hey, let's have elections. And the Shia filled the police units in the new army, including the Badr brigades, as I mentioned, who were just massacring and killing people through the Ministry of Interior. And that was all, supported by the Americans, David Petraeus, James Steele, these guys who were involved in the dirty war in El Salvador. They got moved over to Iraq to run those death squads. But again, it was basically at the end of the day, on both sides, these groups were being controlled. So again, all the Al-Qaeda groups, they never did suicide bombings in Erbil. I think the one or two cases I've been able to find that where they did suicide bombings, again, they were bombings against like PUK offices, like it's a in Erbil, they would do a suicide bombing, but it wasn't even against the KDP office. It was against the PUK office. Mm. So anyways, the origins of Al-Qaeda in Iraq are Kurdish, but with an Arab, front, which was Zarqawi.
There was a tough fight over Kirkuk in those days, though, wasn't there? Between the Sunnis and the Kurds?
Well, the Kurds really wanted to take Kirkuk, and they initially tried during the invasion in 2003. They tried, but they were unsuccessful, and this was another reason why they were using Al-Qaeda, especially against the Yazidis, was that they wanted to basically annex Kirkuk because there's so much oil there, and incorporate it into a state, and then they wanted to have a referendum where they would have all of the Iraqis that live in these so-called disputed territories, which were like on the borders of Kurdistan, which meant like Sinjar, Bashiqa, other areas near Mosul. And both the Kurds and also the Skiri, Hakim's guys that were close to the Americans, both of those groups, with help from the Americans, they managed to insert this clause in the new Iraqi constitution that was passed in 2005, which said, again, there would be a census in Kirkuk to see who's really Arab, who's really Kurdish, and then we're going to have a vote in all these areas that were quote unquote disputed, which the Kurds really wanted, which also had a lot of oil in them, especially Bashiqa. And they had a referendum planned, and they were supposed to do it in 2007. So what the Kurds needed to do was to terrorize the Christians and the Yazidis, make them think that the Sunni Arabs, specifically Al-Qaeda, was trying to commit genocide and kill them. And as a result, that would force the Yazidis to say in Sinjar, which is under central government control, to give up and say, okay, you know what, in this upcoming referendum, we'll go ahead and vote for the Kurds because, they will protect us because these crazy Arabs, Sunni Arabs from Al-Qaeda are killing us. But again, it was the Kurds who were behind these Al-Qaeda groups in Mosul and elsewhere. So I'll give you this major example to hopefully illustrate the point, which had special significance to me because in January of 2007, so this referendum I'm talking about was supposed to take place later that year in December 2007. So I was in Iraq working for a human rights group in late 2006, early 2007. And I went to Sinjar to visit a little village, and I got kidnapped. And the people who kidnapped me, they claimed that they were basically Ba'athist resistance fighters, fighting against the American occupation. And they said they were Arabs. And they kidnapped me, and that's who they said they were. They were Arabs, right? So once I got released, I realized that actually it was members of the Kurdish Democratic Party that had kidnapped me. And there's
That is, again, Barzani's guys, right? Barzani's
guys that had actually kidnapped me, but they just pretended to be Arabs. So that was in January 2007. Now, if you fast forward just a few months to August 2007, there was the biggest terrorist attack in the history of Iraq took place in a place you would never imagine, in these two tiny Yazidi towns in Sinjar called Tel Azar and Sibashe Khidr.
And now remind us where Sinjar is. This is like between Mosul and Kurdistan, right?
It's west of Mosul and near the Syrian border.
Oh, so west of Mosul. Forgive me. Okay.
But again, these are areas that the Kurds want to annex as part of this referendum.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Now, Mount Sinjar, this is where Iraq War III started, supposedly, where the Americans, the excuse was that Reason Magazine believed was we got to go rescue the Yazidis from Mount Sinjar.
Yep, exact same place.
Iraq War III, pardon me, when I say Iraq War III, I mean the beginning of the war against the Caliphate in August of 2014, after they really created it, not just in eastern Syria, but western Iraq in June of 2014, just so people can stick this on their timeline somewhere.
Yeah, so if people remember from the Yazidi genocide, all these tens of thousands or more Yazidis were stuck on top of Sinjar mountain and were starving. They were surrounded by ISIS. When I was kidnapped, I was stuck in some tiny room in a place where I could see the mountain from where I was.
And I'm sorry, what year was this again?
This is way back in 2007.
Okay.
So I'm kidnapped in 2007 in January. I got released, thank God. And so a few months later in August, in that same area, in these two tiny Yazidi towns near the base of Sinjar Mountain, turns out there was the biggest terror attack in Iraq's history, probably the second biggest one only to, well, I don't know, but roughly 1,000 Yazidis were killed when these 4 truck bombs entered these 2 Yazidi towns and detonated, again, killing at least 1,000 people and just flattening large parts of these 2 towns. And immediately the next day, in fact, I should say, an Iraqi Interior Ministry official said that the explosion resembled a mini nuclear bomb. The very next day, the U.S. military and the Peshmerga of Masoud Barzani, they came out and said, "Oh, this has all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda." All the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda, again, blaming it on the Sunni Arabs, basically, who were also living that area around the Yazidis. But all of the Yazidis I interviewed, they tell me the story, which is that at that time, the Peshmerga, Barzani's security forces, they were the ones who had checkpoints surrounding these two Yazidi towns. And like a half an hour before these two massive truck bombs entered the towns, all of Barzani's Peshmerga, like clockwork, withdrew from the checkpoints just in time for these truck bombs to enter and detonate and murder 1,000 people. So every Yazidi that you talk to from those towns, they say, well, yeah, the bombings were blamed on Al-Qaeda, but we know that they were completely coordinated by Masoud Barzani and the Peshmerga.
And now,
because again,
didn't you tell me before when...
So again, and maybe that sounds fantastic, but then shortly after that, some of the Yazidi leaders, many of which are actually on the payroll of the KDP and are kind of co-opted, a bunch of Yazidi leaders came out and said, oh, Al-Qaeda is terrorizing us. And in this upcoming referendum, which is going to take place end of 2007, just 3 months later, they said, we better vote in the referendum to join the Kurdish region under Barzani because we need the protection from Al-Qaeda. So again, all this was happening again at the same time that in Mosul, that Barzani's guy, Khosrow Gorani, was running death squads, killing Yazidis and Christians and taking over their neighborhoods and homes in Mosul. And all of it was to just terrorize Yazidis and Christians to make them say, hey, we better, vote to join the Kurdish region. Otherwise, we're going to get exterminated. So maybe that sounds kind of crazy, but the exact same thing happened then 7 years later in 2014 with the Yazidi genocide itself. Again, your readers might, or your listeners might remember that in June 2014, it was a total shock seemingly out of nowhere. ISIS, with just a couple hundred guys, couple hundred fighters, managed to take over Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. And then that was in June 2014. And then in August 2014, they invaded Sinjar and they did the genocide, again, which people maybe are more familiar with, taking these Yazidi women as sex slaves and pushing them up onto the mountain where they were starving, etc. But again, there's dozens of Yazidis that I've interviewed that survived the genocide. They said the exact same thing happened in 2014. After ISIS took over Mosul, number one, a bunch of Kurdish commanders in the Iraqi army basically withdrew their forces to allow ISIS to come in and take over Mosul. And instead of defending Mosul from ISIS, the Peshmerga immediately sent their forces to Kirkuk to take over the oil. And within literally a week, they were exporting it to Turkey. And then from Turkey, it was put on boats and sent to Israel. And then in August, 2 months later, again, the Peshmerga still occupied Sinjar and had checkpoints around the whole area. And after ISIS took over Mosul, the Peshmerga publicly, the head of the Peshmerga in Sinjar, he was saying, Yazidis, don't worry, we will defend you to the last drop of our blood. A lot of Yazidis were scared to death. They had ISIS on three sides of them, and they wanted to escape and go to Erbil or Duhok. But the Peshmerga wouldn't let them. They said, no, why are you leaving? You have to stay here. We're protecting you. Don't worry. And on August 3rd, again, like clockwork, just like in 2007, to allow these truck bombs into the two Yazidi towns, but this on a much larger scale, all across Sinjar, the Peshmerga, all at once, withdrew without firing a bullet and allowed ISIS to enter all these towns in Sinjar and massacre Yazidi men and enslave Yazidi women. and allowed them to perpetuate the genocide. So it's this constant pattern of the Kurds using Al Qaeda or ISIS or the Islamic State, whichever name they happen to be going by at the time, to terrorize Yazidis and Christians in that part of Iraq on the one hand, but then also to do these suicide bombings against the Shia in other places. And these are policies that were designed to basically tear Iraq apart.
Now, wait a minute. Now, let me ask you, because
sorry, that's a lot of info.
No, it's okay. I want to make sure and follow up on some little points here and there, at least, including you're saying that the CIA, I mean, it would make sense. Of course, the agency's embedded working with the Kurds all through Iraq War II, but you're saying this whole thing essentially was a plot by Washington to help the Kurds, help Al-Qaeda while they're fighting the American military who are fighting on the Shiite side in the Civil War this entire time that we're talking about here.
Well, the Kurdish role of Masoud Barzani with ISIS is indisputable. With the Americans, I'm not sure. I don't have the proof. If that was also an American policy, there's some indications of that. I personally think that's the case. But
what about other reactions by the Americans against Barzani at that time? Did they tilt toward Taliban, or did they threaten Barzani that, like, hey man, we know what you're doing and it's pissing us off, or this kind of thing, or anything?
Not that I've ever found. No. Again,
makes me want to go back and read old Raimondo here. Yeah. Now, one thing, speaking of Hirsch, was Hirsch had, hang on one second. Hirsch had an article, I don't know what year anymore, maybe earlier, like 2005, called Plan B. And it was about how they recognized that the clean break thing didn't work. They were not going to get an oil pipeline to Haifa. They were not going to have a compliant Shiite government like in the clean break fantasies. So instead, Plan B was, we'll just make a deal with the Kurds. And I remember because Raimondo's article at the time was the stab in the back. See, we did this whole war for Israel, and now they're going behind our back to go ahead and break them up, and in a way worse than what the Americans had planned anyway, other than maybe Senator Biden at the time, by making their separate oil deal, especially with the Kurds, over American soldiers' dead bodies.
Yeah, I mean, we know the Israelis do not mind killing Americans. Again, all your listeners, I'm sure, are aware of the USS Liberty.
By the way, I'm sorry, before we go any further, let me just say, I found your Wall Street Journal article that you mentioned. It's called Questions Mount Over Failure to Hit Zarqawi's Camp. This is one of the many, many articles about this. That's the one in the Wall Street Journal from 2004 that you mentioned. It's by Scott, for some reason with only one T, Scott J. Paltrow. Sorry, go ahead.
Again, we know that the Israelis do not have reservations about killing American soldiers, which we know from the USS Liberty incident. So if they are funding an insurgency with the help of the Kurds that's killing American soldiers, maybe some American officers or generals knew about this, or intelligence people, or maybe they didn't. I don't know. I can't speak to that. But the Kurds were doing that. I know that 100%. And the Mossad has an extremely, extremely close relationship with the Kurdish Peshmerga and their intelligence service, the Palestine. And Seymour Hersh did write an article, in fact, about this, where he talks about that relationship. It goes all the way back to the 70s, where the father of Masoud Barzani, Mullah Mustafa, was getting help from the Kurds. And people don't often realize that that there were many Kurdish Jews that left the Erbil region in the 1950s and came to Israel and settled in Esderot, especially, which is right near the Gaza border. A lot of people don't realize that there were a lot of Kurdish Jews. And now in Israel, it's very common to hear like Kurdish music. And in fact, the biggest, craziest, extremist Zionist in Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's Kurdish.
Are you kidding?
He's Kurdish. And Seymour Hersh wrote this plan. I think it might even have double checked, but it might even be the article you mentioned, the Plan B, where he talks about how the Mossad not only gives weapons and training to the Kurdish intelligence and to the Peshmerga, but they also created units, Kurdish units that resemble the Musta'arabin, which is in Israel, there are Arab Jews that speak Arabic and blend in Palestinian society, even marry Palestinian women to, carry out undercover operations. There's the Duvdevan unit that's maybe it was last year they kind of gained a little bit of attention because they burst into this hospital in the West Bank dressed as women, and they murdered some, I think, Hamas guys. Well, not Hamas, but some Palestinian resistance fighters in the West Bank, the Duvdevan Israeli soldiers that, again, speak Arabic, blend in Arab society. Seymour Hersh wrote an article saying that the Israelis had created the equivalent of those among Kurds to infiltrate Arab society. So again, the connection between Israeli intelligence and the Kurds is extremely close. And so if you have them, doing false flag stuff, detonating bombs, again, killing Yazidis and Christians in Mosul on the one hand, and then, setting off bombs at the UN, or at the shrines in Najaf, or this is speculation on my part, maybe blowing up the mosque in Samarra in 2006, which really triggered the worst of the Iraqi civil war. I don't have evidence from that, but I'm just speculating that maybe they did it. But these are all things, again, that create sectarian war, which has, again, helped Israel to divide the country and get at that oil, which they wanted ever since the 2003 invasion. And as you mentioned, they immediately wanted to get that pipeline going to Haifa. And when that didn't work out, later the idea was, hey, if we can help the Kurds take over Kirkuk, and instead of sending oil through the central government to Baghdad and then exporting it, the central government would never, of course, sell oil to Israel. So instead, if we can get the Kurds illegally, without Baghdad's permission, to send oil to Turkey through a special pipeline that the Kurds and the Turks built together, even before ISIS invaded and before the Kurds could take Kirkuk, and send that oil to Turkey and then to Israel, then again, this is a major win for Israel. And so this is what happened in 2014. Like I mentioned, after ISIS took over Mosul with Kurdish help, and then that allowed the Kurdish Peshmerga to take over Kirkuk and get access to all this oil. Within 1 week, they were exporting it to Israel, and within 1 year, according to the Financial Times, just 1 year later, Israel was getting 77% of its oil from Iraqi Kurdistan via Turkey. It would go by pipeline to the Ceyhan port. It would go from through Kurdistan to through Turkey. And Erdogan's son-in-law was in control of the energy ministry, so he'd take his transit fee, and then they'd put them on tankers in the Ceyhan port, and they'd send it right to Haifa. And there was no competitors to even buy the oil because everyone has relations with Iraq, and so the central government, so they couldn't buy this illegal Kurdish oil, but the Israelis could. In fact, the Turks even tried to put some oil on a boat, on a big tanker, and they sent it to the U.S. And it was sitting off the coast of Texas, but a U.S. judge ordered the ship seized because, again, it was illegal for anyone to buy that oil, because it didn't go through Baghdad. And so that ship sat there for like months off the coast of Texas. But again, the only people that could even buy the oil, Israel had a completely captive, it was a completely captive market. They were the only ones that could buy that Kurdish oil. So all of this, again, it goes back to 2003. They wanted to get the oil through the Haifa pipeline, and it didn't work. So they tried again in 2014. But supporting ISIS by way of the Kurds was the way to do all of that.
Yeah. All right. Wait. So, first of all, virtually this entire conversation is the prequel to the story in your book, in a way. So I want to have you back next week to talk about that rather than go for another hour now. I think it'd be better if we just do another section of the interview later. But I wanted to ask you one more thing about what you're talking about in the days of Iraq War II. I believe you told me before, maybe just in a regular conversation, that part of why you were so convinced that the Yazidis were right, that the Kurds not only kind of allowed that truck bombing to happen to them, but were even behind it in the first place, was because they didn't see another reason. They didn't unlike in 2014, where they're trying to consolidate all of this territory and enslave whoever they want and do whatever they want. Where in the days of Iraq War II, the bin Ladenites or even the Sunni-based insurgency had no particular need to go after these Yazidis at all. They were hiding out somewhere, and it wasn't like they were even trying to take over their hideout. You know what I mean? Where they are safe in the foothills of Mount Sinjar and whatever kind of thing, away from the rest of the conflict of the war. So that was one of the reasons I think you told me before why you were more convinced of their story about how Barzani had really directed the bin Ladenites to do it, because there was no other rational reason for them to even bother going that far out of their way to launch that truck bomb attack of, again, 07, you said, right?
Yeah, and if you got time for another story, I can tell you another kind of crazy story.
Tell me a story, man.
That.
I love this stuff. You do such great work. I demand everybody read this book. It's so good, and we're only just barely scratching the surface of what this guy can tell us. Please do continue.
So by the way, if you let me write the book about, you already said you would, so thank you. But if I can write this book about the Yazidi genocide, this is all the history I'll go into.
Of course, yes, we'll publish it. We already have a deal.
So that'll be, half of the book would be about all this, all that buildup I've been talking about. So to give another example, the supposed, you're saying, like you said, why would Al-Qaeda have a reason to go after these Yazidis? They're just off in Sinjar, this remote place. I mean, it really feels like the edge of the earth. There's not much there.
And like I say, I could understand why they would in 14, just because they want to take over this whole area. But in 07, they would need one reason or another to go that far out of their way. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah, so part of the supposed reason, again, to go back to chronology, I got kidnapped in Sinjar in January of 2007. Then in April 2007, in Bashiqa, which is a little town that's like right on the border between Mosul and Erbil, kind of on the border in, again, this disputed area between the central government and the Kurds. There's a little Yazidi town called Bashiqa, and there's a lot of oil there. And the Kurds were actually signing deals with like Chevron and other Western oil companies to exploit the oil fields in these disputed areas, even though they didn't have any control over them yet. So that's a whole nother angle, is the oil part of it, which these American companies were signing deals with the Kurds that were totally illegal on land that didn't even belong to the Kurds. And this little town, Bashiqa, was one of those places. So in April 2014 in Bashiqa, there all of a sudden when, there's this very famous case where this video went viral, essentially, and got shown even on CNN, Western channels, about this poor Yazidi girl who got stoned to death, supposedly by this mob of Yazidis, and supposedly by members of her family. Her name was Dua Khalil Aswad. And so the rumor went around that she had converted to Islam and ran away with a Muslim boy. And so because of that, her family did an honor killing and stoned her to death. And supposedly in response to that is why Al-Qaeda did these huge truck bombings in a few months later in August in 2007, a few months later in Tel Azir and Sibir Sheikh Khadr. But again, I've interviewed Yazidis who are from Bashiqa, and it's even mentioned in Western media reports, and you can even see it in the video, because again, the video, there was somehow, like, now it's very common for things like this to get filmed, with cell phones. Back in 2007, it was not common. Not everyone had an iPhone to pull out at the time. But somehow someone videotaped her death. So it's super brutal, literally people taking big rocks and just crushing her head with it. But in the video, and then also in multiple reports, even in these kind of smaller Western-funded media outlets, people say, including the Yazidis from Bashiqa that I interviewed, they say that in the crowd, of the people stoning her to death were literally Peshmerga security forces. The Peshmerga security forces literally just sat there and watched this girl get stoned to death. And so the Yazidis say the same thing. They say, look, this was a setup where they killed this girl, filmed it, spread it around through the media. That even like put the tape on CDs and took it around all the mosques in Mosul and spread the word that the Yazidis had killed this, newly converted Muslim girl. And it basically sparked pogroms in Mosul. All the Yazidis had to leave Mosul. All the students that were studying there, people that went there to go see the doctors, Yazidis that were working there, especially women, they all had to like escape from Mosul. And about 2 weeks later, there were these 14 Yazidis who were traveling on a bus between Mosul and Bashiqa. And they were stopped by these gunmen, supposedly Al-Qaeda. And they were taken off this bus and executed, these 14 guys. So I talked to a member of the Mosul police at the time. And he said to me that the area of Mosul where this bus of 14 was stopped and these 14 guys were taken off the bus and murdered, this was in a Kurdish-controlled neighborhood. And this guy was completely convinced that, the Kurds had murdered these guys. And on top of that, he said there were many cases where he was in kind of a counter-terror part of the Mosul police for 6-7 years during that period. And he said they would catch Al-Qaeda guys at different times. And they would literally arrest them, hand them over even to the Americans. And then within days, these guys would get released and they'd be back on the streets, these Al-Qaeda operatives. All of it was based in the Kurdish-controlled neighborhoods of Mosul. So again, all of this was to terrorize the Yazidis and convince them that if you don't vote for this referendum that was supposed to take place in 2007 in December, but Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister at the time, he ended up refusing to hold the referendum, even though it was part of the constitution. But the whole idea was to terrorize the Yazidis and say, you better vote for us to join the Kurdish region. Otherwise, Al-Qaeda is going to keep killing you,
Yeah. All right.
So
listen.
maybe the final segue is, again, if you think it's crazy that, the U.S. was supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria in 2011, again, there's all these connections between the Kurds and Al-Qaeda and, by extension, the Israelis and potentially the Americans, although, again, I can't prove it. But then when all these Islamic State or Al-Qaeda in Iraq guys were in prison in 2008, 9, and 10 in Bucca, the Al-Qaeda insurgency was largely defeated by that time. Again, you mentioned there were the awakening groups and the insurgency was basically had been defeated. But all of a sudden in 2009, all these Islamic State leaders just magically got released and from Bucca prison and others, and then they all ended up in Syria. And then there was this huge CIA operation called Operation Timber Sycamore, $1 billion a year supporting Al-Qaeda groups to topple Assad.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that next time. I mean, our interview today, we got a good hour, and it was essentially just part one of so that you understand why Obama would do such a thing, essentially. And I'm really glad that you've gone into such detail about the Kurdish role in all of this. That is the Iraqi Kurdish role. We're not talking about the PKK, YPG leftists. We're talking about Barzani. And I guess I'd like to know more about Talabani and his role in all of this during that time someday. But I definitely want to pick up and talk a little bit more about this book because I have so much to learn from you. Plus, I want other people listening to say, man, I should buy and read this book that this guy William Van Wagenen wrote, which is on sale right now at Amazon.com, published by the Institute, our 17th book, Creative Chaos, Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government by William Van Wagenen. And can we just do this again next Friday?
Yeah, that would be awesome, man. And if I can just take 30 seconds to make one final point. Everybody knows that ISIS carried out a genocide of Yazidis in 2014. The UN recognizes it. All these countries recognize it. Everyone knows what happened to these Yazidis, these women taken as sex slaves, and they know how sad and tragic it is. Almost nobody, at least that's not Yazidi, knows that actually the person responsible for the Yazidi genocide was Masoud Barzani of the KDP, who is currently the head of the biggest political party in Iraqi Kurdistan, who travels to the United States, has traveled to the United States regularly in the past, who still gets military aid from the United States, who gets military aid from Germany. Nobody knows that Masoud Barzani is responsible for the Yazidi genocide. They only used ISIS as a proxy, just like, for example, in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon in 1982, the story that many people know, where these Christian phalangist militias carried out a massacre against Palestinians in a refugee camp in Beirut. But everybody knows that Ariel Sharon was responsible because his troops were in control of Beirut, that part of Beirut, and his soldiers allowed the Christian phalangists to enter the camp and massacre these Palestinians. So everybody holds Ariel Sharon responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacre. It's almost a perfect analogy for what Masoud Barzani and the Peshmerga did in Sinjar on a much larger scale. And almost no one even knows about it. Everyone's saying, condemning ISIS at the UN. You've got Nadia Murad, you've got Amal Clooney in front of the UN saying, "Oh, the Yazidi genocide, give us money because it's so sad." They will not say that it was Masoud Barzani, the best friend of Israel, the US, and Germany, who carried out the genocide. Sorry, that's the final thing I just want to emphasize.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, so come back next Friday and let's talk more about Syria.
Okay. Awesome, man. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, William. Again, everybody, the book is Creative Chaos. It's on Amazon right now. Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.